The dissolution of the monasteries were an incredibly brutal time in which the King Henry VIII and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, sought to grab as much land and wealth from Catholic abbeys, monasteries, priories, and other religious buildings. The suppression led to the crown becoming incredibly wealthy, with Henry then spending much of this gained wealth on his military exploits and campaigns in Europe. However, at the heart of this huge event was the monks and abbots who were made homeless and their way of life was in tatters. There are stories though of brutal executions involving those churchmen who did refuse to hand over control of their abbeys, disagreeing with the king and Cromwell. Today we look at a man who is known as the last Abbot of Reading. So join us today as we look at the brutal execution of Hugh Faringdon. Remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Born around 1490 as Hugh Cook, Hugh Faringdon was born near to the town of Faringdon in West Berkshire. He adopted the surname Faringdon when he became a monk before the turn of the 16th century because of his link to this town. It's believed that he was educated within Reading Abbey, and he served as a sub-cellarer of the monastic building. Hugh was ordained as a priest in March 1511, and within the abbey he rose to the position of sub-chamberlain by 1520. In that year though, the Abbot of Reading Abbey, Thomas Worcester, died, and being an ideal choice, Hugh Faringdon was elected to become the new abbot. As the abbot he became a member of the local aristocracy, and was even given a coat of arms. He was expected to complete his spiritual duties within the abbey, but also took up many different roles that an abbot at the time would undertake, for example becoming a local justice of the peace. He also was called to serve on a number of government commissions for his county at the time. Hugh was a man who was a fan of hunting, and would do this in many of the deer parks that belonged to the abbey. He also had a country house, and initially he was rather friendly with King Henry VIII. The King and Faringdon even went hunting together at times, and they exchanged gifts at New Year's, with Faringdon being gifted £20 in a white leather purse. Hugh also sent the king presents of local trout and hunting knives to reciprocate the gesture. Henry was also his guest on the 30th of January 1521, and Hugh became a chaplain to the king, which shows that their relationship was good. One of the biggest matters of the Tudor period that caused ruptures across England was the matter of Henry VIII's divorce or annulment to his wife, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was getting older, and Henry had grown tired of her and the fact that she could not provide him with a son. This son would have guaranteed the Tudor dynasty, and it was a male heir that Henry greatly quested after. At the time he had grown incredibly fond of a younger lady, Anne Boleyn, who took his eye, but refused to engage with the king too much whilst he was still a married man. At the time it was hard for anyone in society to get a divorce, however the Pope would continue to refuse Henry his request for this. Because of this, Henry tried desperately to find a solution to his marriage problem, and eventually he would get what he wanted, but it came at a huge cost. Henry decided to split from the Catholic Church and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. This caused great anger across England, and Henry did as he pleased, casting Catherine aside and moving Anne Boleyn into the royal apartments. By being the head of the church, Henry could now dictate all religious policy and doctrine, but also punish those who would not support his supremacy. For this, a huge number of people, including some high-profile members of Henry's inner circle and royal court, including Thomas More, were executed for their refusal to support Henry with regards to his marriage and also his supremacy over the church. Hugh Faringdon at the time seemed to have sided with the king throughout his divorce proceedings and the controversy. Henry needed to search for, in a sense, a legal loophole or a way out of his marriage, and during this, the Abbot of Reading Abbey would send him books to help prepare the king's case so it could be presented to the Pope. Hugh Faringdon thought that these books and his support, being a noble Catholic and an abbot, would help, but the Pope continued to refuse to support the divorce of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. Hugh continued to go about his duties within the abbey and also sat in Parliament from the years 1523 to 1539. He, along with other members of the House of Lords, even signed a letter to the Pope which highlighted the bad feeling and chaos that delaying divorce proceedings for Henry could cause. By 1533, Henry had got what he wanted. his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had been declared void, with a marriage to his second wife Anne Boleyn being declared valid. The Pope continued to cause more problems, saying that Henry's first marriage was in fact valid, and the fact that he had married his brother's widow wasn't an issue. Parliament then passed an act confirming that the marriage was null, and it was required by many high-up members of society and the clergy to accept and acknowledge the validity of Henry and Anne's marriage. Hugh signed this and, along with other abbots, accepted the royal marriage. In 1536, he also signed the Articles of the Faith, which basically acknowledged the supremacy of the king over the church and accepted Henry as the supreme head of the church. However, with the king in charge of the church, he began to systematically begin a policy that would bring brutal change to England forever. The king was short of money in the royal coffers due to the fact he had been embarking on many expensive military campaigns across Europe, and he needed more money quickly. What he decided to do would change England forever. He set his chief minister Thomas Cromwell in charge of the dissolutions of the monastery, in which the crown disbanded monasteries, friaries, convents and priories across Henry's realm. With this, monks were forced out of their homes, their incomes stolen, the riches of these holy buildings taken and instantly being transferred to the royal treasury. This policy was brutal and was carried out across England, with the crown and king stealing large swathes of land across the nation. Visits were made to monasteries and houses in 1535 by groups of investigators sent by Cromwell. The purpose of these visits were to find any small amount of poor behaviour or problems within the monastery. For example, if some monasteries had been slightly corrupt, then Cromwell would have an easy excuse to shut the building down, make all of the monks homeless and seize the wealth and building. Reading Abbey was visited and valued as the second richest rural abbey across England, behind Glastonbury Abbey. When the inspectors visited the abbey, it was found that no lack of piety or poor behaviour was occurring within the monastic order of the house. In 1536, England across the north was plagued with rebellion, which sought to change religion and the king's supremacy back to how it was before. Many people across the country were furious with the changes made to religion, and for this, investigators sought to find out any treasonous behaviour. Hugh Faringdon was one of these investigators, and he was tasked with finding out about any treasonous behaviour in Reading. This shows us that the king must have regarded Hugh Faringdon as a useful tool and as an ally at the time. His favour with the king continued throughout late 1537, as Hugh acted as a royal chaplain and officiated 2 funeral services for Henry's third wife Jane Seymour, with Hugh singing the Requiem at St George's Chapel and also being present at the Queen's burial. In 1538, Hugh appointed Thomas Cromwell to the office of High Steward of Reading in an attempt to gain favour with Cromwell. This may have been an attempt to get Cromwell to back off with his dissolution of Reading Abbey. The records state that when the commissioners arrived to take control of Reading Abbey, the abbot willingly conformed and there was no uproar or protest. Hugh handed over the religious relics held by the abbey, which included the hand of St James, and these had been locked behind the abbey's high altar. One of Cromwell's investigators, Dr. London, did say how, under Hugh, the monastic order was properly conducted. Hugh Faringdon, having lost his abbey, did instruct a fellow prior of Leominster Priory to surrender his house to the king, but the prior failed to do so. In early September of 1539, Abbot Hugh Faringdon of Reading Abbey was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The abbey had been possessed by the king's agents, and he was held in custody. It's commonly accepted how Hugh was indicted and arrested due to the fact he refused to hand over control of Reading Abbey, but sources also suggest how he could have been arrested for treason due to allegedly supporting rebels in the north and giving them money. Hugh's abbey was taken under Cromwell's investigators and was made property of the crown. The abbey was dissolved and closed on the 19th of September 1539. As Hugh was a mitred abbot, he was entitled to a trial by Parliament, and a court was established to try him and 2 other priests. He was accused of high treason in the vein that he had denied Henry VIII's supremacy over the church. Some sources state that a trial did not take place, with the death penalty being imposed upon the abbot before one did. However, others argue that a trial was incredibly quick. It took place allegedly on the 13th of November 1539, and within a day Hugh Faringdon was found guilty and sentenced to death by being hanged, drawn and quartered. On the 14th of November 1539, the day after the trial took place, the 3 men accused, including Abbot Hugh Faringdon, were dragged out of their cells and tied onto hurdles in the centre of the town of Reading. This town was extremely familiar to Hugh, and it must have been horrific for him to be publicly shamed in front of the abbey and also the people who he had done so much for. The 3 men were dragged around on hurdles behind a horse throughout the town of Reading in front of the huge crowds that had gathered. The death sentence for the men said how the aforementioned Hugh, Abbot of the Monastery of Reading, John Eynon and John Rugg should be taken to the King's Jail of Reading, and they should be separately dragged throughout the middle of the town of Reading to the place of execution and there hanged on the gallows, and each should be taken down while living and laid on the ground, and their bellies taken out and burned while they are alive, and their heads cut off, and their bodies shall be cut into 4 parts, their heads and quarters shall be placed wherever the Lord King should wish. After being humiliatingly and painfully dragged through the streets of Reading on a hurdle, Hugh Faringdon and the other 2 men were taken to their place of execution. A gallows had been assembled in Reading, and they were then hanged until almost dead in front of the large crowd, but were then cut down whilst they were still alive. This all took place outside of the Abbey's gateway, which still survives today. At this point, Hugh Faringdon was then disemboweled, with his insides ripped out whilst still being alive and burned on a fire nearby. It was then that Hugh Faringdon, the Abbot of Reading Abbey, was brutally beheaded, with his body being cut into 4 quarters. The remains of Hugh were then placed all around the town and displayed above the abbey, which he once proudly oversaw. Hugh Faringdon, although close to Henry VIII, was another victim of the king's greed in the event known as the Dissolution of the Monasteries. The dissolution led to much change across England, and also much horror with the crown seizing huge amounts of land and money. But today we can still see the remnants of the suppression today in the ruined monastic buildings and religious structures that still stand today in England. Hugh Faringdon seemed like a man that Henry VIII trusted, but a man that wasn't at all trusted by Thomas Cromwell. He died a horrifically brutal way, being hanged, drawn and quartered, and his execution would have come at a great shock to many across the country. It's believed by some that his execution was carried out as a clear message to other abbots and church landowners to hand over their properties to Henry VIII and Cromwell. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.